It was not supposed to be like this. For once, the EU was going to set its own agenda. European countries agree that they need to take charge of their own destiny, and this week, leaders from the EU 27 were going to hunker down and get serious about boosting European industry. You know, everybody's favorite C word, competitiveness. I mean, that's the word I expected to be echoing around this corridor as I stand here towards the end of the latest European Council summit. Nope. Once again, Donald Trump hijacked the agenda. This time, it's the war he's waging on Iran alongside Israel. Europe isn't officially involved, but it sure is affected by snarled trade routes, spiking energy prices, and fears that the violence won't stay limited to the Middle East for long. Indeed, Israel and Iran might both be guilty of war crimes by targeting energy infrastructure. That's what UN Secretary General António Guterres told my colleague Anne McElvoy in an interview for this podcast.
If there are attacks either on Iran or from Iran, energy infrastructure, I think that there are reasonable grounds to think that they might constitute a war crime.
Were you suggesting that each or both sides could have committed a war crime?
Both sides. I don't see any difference in relation to if we target civilians, it doesn't matter who targets civilians. The targeting of civilians is totally unacceptable. And of course, civilian infrastructure like this one is also extremely, extremely serious.
Guterres spoke to Anne in Brussels after conferring with EU 27 leaders over lunch. It was part of a marathon meeting where they grappled, once again, with the seeming impotence of big international organizations like the United Nations and the European Union. So what can the EU do to insulate citizens from the fallout of Trump's war in Iran? How will the instability affect Brussels' other priorities, like Ukraine and strategic autonomy? And even if there were solutions to all these problems, would countries actually manage to agree on any of them? I'm Sarah Wheaton, host of EU Confidential. Later in the episode, we'll bring you more of Anne McElvoy's interview with the UN Secretary General. But first, it's a European Council summit, and so we are here late on a Thursday night in the Justus Lipsius building. Joining me are Zoya Sheftalovich, a familiar voice and chief EU correspondent. She's not to be confused with our senior climate reporter, Zia Weise. And also here is chief foreign affairs correspondent Nick Vinocur. So I went back and re-listened to our episode from the previous UCO in January. Zoya and Nick, you guys were both there with me. And at that time, leaders were actually feeling pretty good. Trump had just backed down on his threats against Greenland. They felt like they had a game plan. They thought they might actually use their trade bazooka. At the same time, they came away saying, look, what worked here is we were united, and okay, we get it. We need to make some big reforms to help us stand on our own. And so they planned this summit to talk about competitiveness, and then it all devolved into chaos again. Nick.
That's right. I mean, this is sort of a pattern where effectively it's Donald Trump setting the agenda of one European Council after another. The last one was Greenland. This one, where it was the war in Iran, that has completely overshadowed this summit with the energy crisis that it's caused. So that immediately went to the top of the agenda, the spike in global energy prices, and various European countries saying we need help right now, short-term fixes to deal with these crises. And effectively, as they're sitting here, we find out that Belgium's energy supply, Italy's energy supply is going to be severely affected by strikes that have happened in Qatar. There's very sort of live feeling that this was another crisis summit, effectively.
We also kind of in parallel saw this debate about to what extent countries should intervene, help Trump try to clear the blockage in the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, this has been a topic of conversation over the past week. At the beginning of the week, Donald Trump got really mad after EU countries said that they weren't going to be helping out and, look elsewhere. There was a conversation at the Council tonight around what is going to happen with that should the EU actually contribute. In part, there is a fear that if the EU doesn't help out the US now, then Trump may retaliate and not help Ukraine. So there is this sense that maybe Europe does need to do something. So there was a discussion around perhaps what that looks like is some sort of a UN-focused mission that the EU contributes to. There were a few countries, 5 countries, that came out overnight and said, look, we would consider sending ships to such a mission. So I think there was kind of coalescing around the idea that maybe Europe does need to step up a little bit and help secure the strait, not to condone what Israel and the US are doing in Iran necessarily, but to ensure that the global flow of oil and fertilizer and so forth through the Strait of Hormuz continues.
Yeah, and just to plug the next part of the podcast, Anne McElvoy interviewed António Guterres, and he made some points about how hard it will actually be to clear out the Strait of Hormuz. But sticking with the EU, actually, we saw the intersection of all of these wars and energy availability collide with regard to one country. Zoya, you've been talking about it all week. Hungary, there was a big question if they would be able to get Viktor Orbán to drop his late veto on the 90 billion euro loan to Ukraine. Didn't work.
It did not, Sarah. And what was interesting to me was there were a few people, particularly in the Berlin camp, who thought that maybe we would get here in the end. And they thought that maybe what would happen is Vladimir Zelensky would ring into this video conference and he would perhaps assure Viktor Orbán, yeah, look, I'm going to fix this pipeline. They thought maybe that commission mission that was en route to the site of that damage might have arrived, inspected it, and given a sense of what the timing might look like. So there were all sorts of plans. And the story that I've got coming out shortly has some reporting about what happened in the room last night. Ultimately, what happened was Viktor Orbán was not interested in any of the solutions that were being offered. He wanted to make this a political point for his election campaign ahead of that April 12 election. And so the leaders pretty quickly, within like 90 minutes, realized he wasn't going to be budging. And so they just called it quits and they said, that's it. We will move this to the next UCO in April. That's the informal European Council summit in Cyprus. And I think that's when this issue is going to be really back front and center, because the leaders today were hideously upset at the fact that Orbán went back on his word that he gave at that December UCO. So I think by the time we meet again in April, there's going to be some sort of coalescing. If Orbán is back, then there will be some action at that EU Council summit.
Nick, what are some of the ideas for how to deal with Orbán? It seems like there's kind of a mix of carrot and sticks.
Yeah, I mean, up until now, there has been a desire not to feed into his election campaign. So any action, any statement that would be inflammatory or sort of build on the conflict, they knew that Orbán was going to feed it right into his social media account. And that's effectively what he did right here today. He came out of the council room and started recording videos about how he's isolated. What I've been hearing from some diplomats, and this is a little bit sort of early stage, is that if he is reelected, they're willing to start a serious conversation of how to deal with Hungary, or basically the idea of rebellious states that don't behave in sincere cooperation with other EU countries. We know that the Article 7, this would allow them to strip voting rights from Hungary. That's a tough hurdle to cross because you need effectively unanimity -1, but they're also talking about other avenues, more funds that can be frozen, and other ways of sort of reining in Orbán. And everything we heard, just like Zoya was saying, is that the tone around the table was harsher and more confrontational than it ever has been before tonight in Brussels.
Yeah, we heard in the closing press conference, Council President António Costa, known for being kind of a backslapper friendly guy, saying the Council cannot be blackmailed. Remains to be seen. Zia, I want to turn to you. So let's dive into this energy pricing debate affecting the whole bloc. You've been reporting on this really fascinating tension. This is the second time in 4 years that European countries have been cut off from a major fossil fuel supplier. So it makes sense to double down on renewables, but it's not a fast fix.
It's important to keep in mind that at least for the time being, there's not really a problem with supply. Qatar, for example, is only 4% of the EU's gas supply. The real problem is that all of this is driving up prices on global markets, and the EU is really exposed to that. And yeah, to that, renewables aren't a short-term fix. They're a long-term fix, like they're going to wean the EU off fossil fuels, off imports. But a lot of the debate here today in Brussels has been, what can we do in the short term? What can we ask of the European Commission in the short term without having any unintended side consequences and side effects that hamper the more long-term goals?
And some countries are pushing to at least temporarily scrap the EU's major lever for renewables and for fighting climate change. Can you walk us through a little bit through the emissions trading system and what the discussion was about today?
Sure. I mean, the emissions trading system basically reduces emissions by having factories and power plants pay for their emissions. So it sort of incentivizes a switch to cleaner production methods, cleaner sources of energy. But because it charges that price, it also adds a little bit to energy bills. And it actually adds roughly 11%. I mean, it accounts for 11% of the average European bill. That's comparatively little, but it is a bit higher in some countries that are particularly dependent on fossil fuels, such as Poland or the Czech Republic. And from those countries, you hear a lot of demands that, can you please do something about this to the European Commission? Can you please take the price down? Can you do something about that? And on the other side, you have countries that are sort of more climate ambitious, like Spain, like the Nordics, that say, do not touch this instrument. It's been really successful.
And so where did we land? Are they going to make changes to this really landmark system?
So what you heard today is that there'll be a long-planned reform that the Commission will do this summer, and that it will be modernized. In so far, it's really not a huge decision that happened here. I think the can's basically being kicked down the road. I mean, this is basically sort of the starting gun's been fired for the lobbying around, government lobbying around this reform. And we'll probably keep coming back to this exact debate for the next few leader summits.
So is the EU actually doing anything to provide relief on energy price spikes caused by the war?
So the Commission's tactic is broadly to sort of pass the buck to member states and saying, look, you can cut power taxes or grid charges or do some subsidies to help people and companies with their energy bills. But they've also said they're going to try and look into some more short-term things. Ursula von der Leyen promised to make some proposals and adjustments over the coming days and weeks and months that are not entirely clear yet. So we'll have to see what they are.
Okay, days and weeks and months. I think we're all actually just hoping this conflict will resolve itself in the days and weeks and months. Not seeing a lot of signs that the EU is going to do much in that direction. Stepping back, when António Costa came in as the new head of the European Council, he was really trying to say, look, I'm a friendly guy. I want us all to get along. We're going to have retreats together with the leaders. He went to each capital. He kind of famously cultivated an individual relationship with Viktor Orbán. I'm not seeing that he really has anything to show for it. Orbán's going back on his promises. This is the second time that we've seen statements on Ukraine signed not by 27 countries, not even by 26 countries, but by only 25 countries now. He's losing people. Nick, what does this say about Costa's effectiveness?
Yeah, I think this is a big test for him, and we saw it in his press conference at the end of this council, where he's trying to reassert his authority, essentially, and say, we will not allow ourselves to be blackmailed by Viktor Orbán. But as you said, this is actually the second time that Orbán, or probably more than that, has come and has basically called the leaders' bluff and come to a council with some obstruction, some obstacle, and the EU leaders have prided themselves with finding a way around it or finding some kind of trade with Orbán to bring him on board. And effectively, they've never really, gotten him to sort of bend in a way. And I've certainly heard the critique from some diplomats around town that Costa's method, which is friendly, exchanges of letters, may not be all that effective. And they also point to the fact that in this latest standoff, Costa sent a letter to Orbán saying, you have violated a key principle of the European Union, and people were expecting some consequences, and those consequences have not yet come. So you're hearing critiques saying, we should be playing more hardball with Viktor Orbán. That's not what Costa's doing. He is the good cop in this scenario, but obviously that is showing its limits.
And Zoya, in the lead up to this summit, we heard a lot of complaints from countries that Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was overstepping her authority to make decisions about EU foreign policy. But we're seeing EU leaders just get farther and farther apart on that.
Yeah, I think there was always criticism around Ursula von der Leyen perhaps doing too much, going too far, taking too much power, centralizing power. The flip side of that, which is the argument that her people make and her backers make and have been making to me repeatedly over the last few weeks, is, look, no one else is doing it. We don't have a Merkel figure who's taking charge, who's ringing up Viktor and making him bend. We don't have someone, like Macron at the peak of his powers who's able to come in and really make the decisions that need to be made. So the argument is, look, there is a vacuum. There is no one. Friedrich Merz, the German chancellor, isn't doing it. The French president is weakened because of the fact that he's facing this election next year. So ultimately, what the backers of von der Leyen say is, no one else is doing it. Someone's got to take charge. And so she stepped into that void. So I think there are two sides to that argument. But certainly you do get a sense of frustration among certain diplomats and from certain countries who are saying, look, Ursula von der Leyen, take a step back. This is our job.
Last time we talked about the summit being a tipping point when there was a clear game plan for dealing with Trump. What are you going to be watching over the next month, let's say, if we're writing the first draft of history here, to make your judgment about the significance of this UCO?
I would look at Ukraine, basically. I don't know if it's this UCO, but clearly what we're seeing is Trump's attention drift away, even further away from Ukraine. Now he's fully invested in the Iran war. He's losing interest in the peace process, and that's putting more of the onus on the Europeans to be able to supply Ukraine, to be able to push that peace process forward. So it'll be interesting to watch if the Europeans try to really kind of grab the wheel in the peace process, perhaps even started some form of dialogue directly with Putin. That's been floated by a few leaders now. I think that's a dynamic to watch really closely in coming months.
For me, I think this Hungarian election is really all I'm thinking about. Because I think if Viktor Orbán is re-elected and he comes back to that next European Council summit, the informal in Cyprus, and he is still acting like a blocker, or even if he's not acting like a blocker, but just, having seen what he did and the fact that he went back on his word, and the EU does nothing, then that's going to be a huge, huge tell about its powerlessness. I think what I'll be watching for is, do they put forward some sort of plan, some sort of punishment? Because what he has done has crossed a red line. All of the leaders have said it. Costa said it. Von der Leyen said it. So, if you cross a red line, usually that means you've got to get punished. So I'm going to be looking to see whether he suffers any sorts of consequences at that April summit if he's still in power. If he doesn't win that election, then of course I'll be watching very closely to see what his competitor Peter Magyar does.
Well, we are all exhausted. Some of you still have deadlines to meet. So Zia, Nick, Zoya, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for me.
All right, we'll leave it there, but we'll be back shortly with Anne's conversation with António Guterres. Welcome back. And now to a Politico exclusive, Anne McElvoy's interview with António Guterres, the UN Secretary General.
Thanks, Sarah. UN Secretary-General António Guterres is in Brussels for the EU Council, probably one of his last appearances with European leaders as his mandate ends in December. He's also been meeting Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President. Mr. Guterres has said the war in the Middle East must stop, but as the attacks and retaliation rise, is his organisation still relevant, or a toothless relic of the rules-based order? António Guterres, welcome to this EU Confidential interview.
It's a very, very big pleasure to do it.
So we are sitting here in the UN building in Brussels, next door to the European Council, in between your meetings with EU leaders. And ahead of the summit, you said de-escalation and dialogue are the only way out of the crisis in Iran and across the Gulf. You urged a return to the negotiating table. Are you at all confident, after your visit to Brussels, that that could be possible?
Well, it is possible, but it depends on the political will to do it. I am convinced that Israel as a strategy wants to achieve total destruction of the military capacity of Iran and regime change. I believe Iran has a strategy which is to resist as much time as possible and to cause as much harm as possible to the world at large, not only to the region. And so the key to solve the problem is in the US. And I think, I hope that sooner rather than later, the US decides to claim that they have done their job, that they have won, let us say, from their perspective. The war, is my deep belief, needs to stop. And I believe that it is in the hands of the US to make it stop.
And you believe that there could be an outcome in which the US would be seen to have won this war?
Well, I think that President Trump will be able to convince those that need to be convinced that the work is done, that the war can end.
Can I ask if you've spoken with President Trump at all in this crisis?
No. I've been in contact with all sides. And indeed, it's my deep belief that it's absolutely vital for the world at large that this war ends quickly. And by the way, the biggest beneficiary of this war is Russia. Russia has violated international law, has violated the Charter.
The Iran crisis is a distraction from this.
Russia is the country that is gaining more with what's happening in this horrible disaster that is the Iran crisis.
But the conflict has intensified after Iran struck at the gas facilities in Qatar and after its own South Pars gas field was targeted by Israeli strikes. We've seen markets in turmoil. We've seen a very strong worded post from President Trump warning Iran against further attacks in Qatar. In a sense, it does look, this particular incident and the fallout from it, even in the time I think that you've been here on the ground in Europe, has been immense. Is it spiralling out of control?
This is indeed spiraling out of control, and the recent attacks represent an escalation that is extremely, extremely dangerous. And that is the reason why I believe that we must stop this war sooner rather than later, because, as you mentioned, things have spiraled out of control.
It was interesting that you gave your first answer really about the US and the US influence, and if they got to the point where they could say the job is done, they could withdraw from this conflict. But at the same time, we have President Trump saying the US knew nothing about Israel's attack on the gas field in Iran on Wednesday. Do you feel the US still has influence over Israel in this conflict to hold off on attacks in Iran, given what happened overnight?
But that's exactly what proves that only the US can stop this war, because apparently Israel has, as I said, an objective that is the total destruction of the capacities of Iran, the regime change, which were never enunciated in the objectives by the United States. So my hope is that the United States will be able to understand that this has gone too far.
The director of the US National Counterterrorism Centre, Joe Kent, who resigned this week in protest at the war, said Iran posed no immediate threat to our nation, to the US, and that the war started due to pressure from Israel. Do you believe that to be true?
I have no doubt that this was expressed by the Secretary of State. I have no doubt that this was something that corresponds to Israel's strategy that has been since a long time ago to draw the United States into a war with Iran. That objective was achieved, but now there is another objective that is much more important. This conflict is creating dramatic suffering in Iran, but in the region, even in Israel. And it is creating a devastating impact in the global economy, whose consequences are still early to foresee. So we absolutely must end the conflict, absolutely must open the Strait of Hormuz, we absolutely must create conditions for the oil, gas, fertilizers to again have access to the global markets. If not, some countries, especially the most vulnerable countries, will suffer enormously. And they have nothing to do with this conflict.
The Charter of the International Criminal Court defines attacks against civilian infrastructure, including energy infrastructure, as constituting crimes of war. And we've seen this broadening out in the last few days into attacks on oil and gas facilities. Do you believe that war crimes, in any sense of that phrase, have been committed in the attacks on Iran?
If there are attacks either on Iran or from Iran, energy infrastructure, I think that there are reasonable grounds to think that they might constitute a war crime. Apparently there was an attack on Iran on a gas field, and there were attacks from Iran into a gas complex in Qatar.
Were you suggesting that each or both sides could have committed a war crime?
Both sides. I don't see any difference in relation to if we target civilians, it doesn't matter who targets civilians. The targeting of civilians is totally unacceptable. And of course, civilian infrastructure like this one is also extremely, extremely serious.
Secretary General, what role do you think the UN can play in this conflict? I'm thinking of Iran here, but also you've had the Gaza-Israel crisis to deal with as well. Given that the US is really not working in depth with your organisation at all, you've just said, in these extraordinarily dangerous times, you haven't had a conversation with President Trump. Do you believe that the UN has been sidelined?
No, we are in contact with the United States. We are in contact with Iran. We are in contact with some key actors. The Arab countries of the Gulf, with the European Council, where I just was. My main objective is to see if it is possible to create conditions in the Strait of Hormuz similar to what in the past we managed in relation to the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Of course, it's a different context, it will be a different solution, but we would like to be useful, and we are establishing contacts for it, and we are prepared to manage a system, a mechanism in place, because we have that experience, and we have task forces created to be able to do it, but of course it depends on the will of the parties.
I wonder what success within the bounds of the achievable would look like for you. Is it reopening the Strait of Hormuz to international shipping within a few days? That seems to be a big pressure point. We've seen other governments come in behind that push. What would you consider from this situation to be the best next development that you could, in reality, hope that you would leave Brussels?
The rest is in the war. And it will be, we are conscious how difficult it will be to have the Strait of Hormuz open in the context of a war going on. In any case, we will be doing our best in relation to the possibilities, either global or of a humanitarian nature. We had that experience of negotiation in the past, as I said, but we believe it will be very difficult if the war doesn't stop. So our priority, the absolute priority, is to stop the war and create conditions for the straits to be open, and to be open without any kind of risk. Because, as you know, the drama is, it's not only the question of the capacity or not to destroy a ship. It is you have insurance companies, you have shipping companies, you have the seafarers. And if a drone explodes close to a ship, this creates immediately an environment in which it's very difficult to make things move. So I think it's very important not to forget the central objective. And the central objective is to end the war.
European leaders have refused President Trump's request to participate in policing the opening of the Strait of Hormuz, or sending their own ships or any other materiel to that effect. Do you think that's been the right position? I mean, certainly the position of, say, Keir Starmer in the UK, that this is not a conflict he wants to get drawn into. Friedrich Merz says something similar in Germany, and that's pretty much, I think, becoming a majority position among the main powers. You could argue if you want to keep the Straits open, more should be done and more could be sent to deterrent effect by Britain, by Germany, by others.
Well, I'm not convinced that it is the number of warships in the Strait that solves the problem. As I said, this is something that can only work if the seafarers, the shipping companies, the insurance companies have confidence that ships can move safely. So this is not only a matter of number of warships around, it's a matter of having or not a war environment in which an accident can happen at any moment.
So you think Keir Starmer broadly struck the right tone in approach, holding back British support?
I don't make comments about what the Prime Minister of Britain does. I think he did it in his understanding of the best interest of his country.
Yes, it was, I should say, it was also today. We've seen the leaders of UK, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Japan, in a joint statement calling for the Straits to be open but effectively holding back. The question is, you think broadly restraint is better for these powers, who many of whom have military power? They shouldn't get involved.
I think these countries made their own reading of the situation, and I believe that they took a decision not to get too much involved, knowing that the most important objective is deconfliction, is de-escalation and peace.
Your term as Secretary-General will come to an end later this year. The process for appointing your successor is underway, which must be bittersweet after so long on this stage, on the international
No, it's not bitter nor sweet. It's just my duty to do everything I can until the very last day.
And there is a call for a woman to be appointed as your successor. I think Annalena Baerbock, as the General Assembly President, has said that. Do you agree? And do you think Ms. Baerbock might be a good candidate?
Oh, I have no doubt. I've had excellent cooperation with her. I mean, I will not be part of the electoral campaign, but I can only tell you that I have the best impression about our cooperation, and I think she has been an absolutely outstanding President of the General Assembly.
I should just ask you to finish, what you feel you're seeing. We've seen the European countries really trying to figure out the right response here, but there have been some differences. Some have said international law is no longer the best guideline. Ursula von der Leyen said something, I'm paraphrasing her, but along the lines that, it may not be the be-all and end-all anymore. Friedrich Merz said something similar. Then we have Mr. Costa saying it's still international law.
It's very easy to misinterpret things. I mean, I was with Ursula von der Leyen today, and she was adamant of the need to respect international law, to respect the Charter, and to have a rules-based order. So I think if there is something that I felt today in my meeting with the Council, that there was a very strong commitment was to not only international law, but multilateralism, and a very solid support to the UN. And I'm very grateful for that.
So you leave this pre-UCO visit in good heart about Europe's future in this crisis time?
Europe is essential. I mean, I'm a great supporter of the idea that power relations must be changed. We cannot live under the world will not be properly managed if it depends on one single power or if it is divided between two single powers. We need a multipolar networked world. And we see developed countries, but we see emerging economies, and we need to interlink them more and more with trade treaties, technology, forms of cooperation, etc., to balance power in international relations, allowing to create the conditions for multilateralism to be effective. Because the problem of multilateralism today is that because of the reckless behavior of the superpowers, there is no space for multilateral institutions to be able to deliver.
António Guterres, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And I'll now hand us all back to Sarah Wheaton.
Thanks, Anne. I'm actually finally off to bed, but if people want to hear more of your interview, they can check out politico.eu for a longer write-up. Make sure to subscribe to the Brussels Playbook podcast. That's the feed you're listening to us on right now. Please send questions, comments, even voice notes to us over WhatsApp. You'll find it in our show notes. Thanks to Peter Snowden, senior audio producer. I'm Sarah Wheaton. See you next week.
It's tax season, and at LifeLock, we know you're tired of numbers. But here's a big one you need to hear. Billions. That's the amount of money in refunds the IRS has flagged for possible identity fraud. Now here's another big number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, we'll fix it guaranteed. One last big number. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast for the threats you can't control. Terms apply.